Something is happening right now in the Cessna 172 market that the listing platforms haven't announced, that no press release has covered, and that most buyers scrolling through Trade-A-Plane or Controller on their lunch break haven't quite put together yet. But the data is sitting right there in plain sight if you know exactly what you're looking for and how to read it correctly. Over the last 90 days, something has shifted in how 172s are being listed, how long they're sitting before they move, and what the actual transaction prices look like compared to where asking prices were camped out for the better part of 2 years. And what that data is telling us, when you pull it together and look at it honestly, is that the price correction that a lot of people in this community have been either predicting or desperately hoping for, depending on which side of the transaction they're standing on, has quietly, without any dramatic announcement, already started. This isn't a prediction video. I'm not telling you something is coming. I'm telling you it's already here. It's already showing up in the numbers, and by the time you finish watching this, you're going to have a much clearer picture of exactly where it's showing up, why it's showing up there specifically, and what it means if you are actively trying to buy, sell, or finance a 172 in the next 6 to 12 months. Because the details matter an enormous amount here. The correction isn't happening uniformly across the whole 172 market. It's concentrated in specific model years, specific configurations, specific regions, and it's being driven by a set of forces that are genuinely different depending on which part of the market you're looking at. Understanding the specific forces at play is what separates making a smart decision with real money from making an expensive mistake based on a rough headline about prices coming down. Hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of breakdown I do on a consistent basis. Real market data, real analysis, none of the fluff, and if you're even loosely interested in the economics of piston aircraft ownership, you are going to want to be here for what's coming over the rest of this year. Let's start with the backdrop, because context is everything when you're trying to read short-term market data correctly. The 172 market didn't get to where it was at its peak by accident, and it's not correcting for any single simple reason, so you need to hold the whole picture in your head at once for the individual data points to make sense the way they actually should. The Cessna 172 is by almost any measure the most purchased, most recognized, most discussed single-engine piston airframe in the history of general aviation. There are more of them flying, more of them insured, more of them in hangar and tie-down situations across the country than almost any other type you can name. That ubiquity is genuinely meaningful from a market dynamics standpoint, because it means the 172 market behaves slightly differently from a niche or limited production type. There's more inventory, more comparable sales data, more insurance market maturity around the type, and more financing history. Lenders understand what a 172 is. Underwriters understand what a 172 is. That familiarity cuts in some useful directions and in some less useful ones, as we're going to get into, but the baseline point is that the 172 market is liquid enough and large enough that when it moves, you can actually see it moving in the data in a way that's harder to spot in a type with only a few hundred examples on the market at any given time. Here's where prices actually were when the market was running at peak temperature, because it's easy to forget just how far things moved in a relatively short window. Going back to 2019 and into 2020, a mid-70s 172M or 172N, solid airframe, Continental or Lycoming engine, basic panel, nothing fancy, was trading in a range that felt aggressive at the time, but looks almost reasonable from where we're sitting today. Call it $65,000 to $85,000 for something that was in genuinely good shape, annual done, no immediate squawks, flying regularly. A G1000 equipped 172 SP from the early to mid-2000s, the kind that flight schools run hard and private owners buy off them when the schools cycle them out, was somewhere in the range of $90,000 to $110,000 in that same pre-pandemic window, depending on airframe hours, engine time remaining, and avionics configuration. Then the pandemic hit, and what happened to the 172 market between mid-2020 and the peak in late 2022 into early 2023 was, depending on your vantage point, either remarkable or alarming. That same mid-70s airframe that was selling for $70,000 went to $90,000, then $110,000, then $125,000 on listings that would have been laughed at 2 years earlier. The G1000 equipped SP that was $100,000 pre-pandemic moved to $150,000, then $175,000, then close to $200,000 for examples, with good engine time and a well-maintained interior. New 172S models from Cessna, and they are genuinely expensive new because the liability and certification cost structure that goes into every new Cessna off the Independence, Kansas line is real and not going away. We're being ordered with deposits and wait lists, which push the entire used market up underneath them, as buyers who couldn't get new pricing or a delivery slot were forced to compete aggressively for used inventory that was genuinely constrained. The forces driving that run-up were real, and they were multiple. Pandemic-era psychology around outdoor, socially distanced activity pushed a wave of new and returning pilots into the market simultaneously. Stimulus money and early pandemic asset appreciation in real estate and equities put discretionary money into pockets that hadn't felt that way in a while. Interest rates were historically low, which made financing a $150,000 airplane feel meaningfully different than it would feel at 5 or 6 or 7%. Flight schools were buying anything they could find to meet surging training demand. And underneath all of that, the sheer psychological energy of a period when people were reassessing their lives and deciding to do the things they'd been putting off, including, for a lot of people, finally learning to fly or getting back to flying after years away, created demand that was genuinely broad-based and not easily dismissed as a bubble, even while it was inflating. What's changed since that peak, and changed in a way that's now showing up clearly in the 90-day listing data, is a set of forces working in the other direction. Not a single dramatic reversal, not a crash in the classic sense, but a meaningful, multi-factor softening that has steadily chipped away at the psychology that was supporting those peak prices. Interest rates are the most obvious and most significant single factor, and it's worth spending real time on this rather than just mentioning it in passing and moving on, because the mathematical reality of what rate changes do to the financing picture for a 172 purchase is more concrete and more powerful than a lot of buyers and sellers seem to have actually internalized yet. Let's run the numbers so this is as clear as it can possibly be. At the kind of rates that were available in 2020 and into 2021, financing a 172 purchase, even a relatively expensive one, produced monthly payments that felt manageable to a broad range of buyers. A buyer financing $120,000 over 15 years at 3.5% was looking at a monthly payment in the range of $850 to $900. That's real money, but it's also within striking distance of what a lot of people spend on a car payment, which is essentially the mental comparison buyers are making, whether they admit it or not. It felt accessible to people who wanted badly enough to own an airplane and were making a decent living. Run that same loan at $120,000, same 15-year term, at 7% instead of 3.5%, and the monthly payment moves to just over $1,080. That's close to a 25% increase in monthly cost for the identical airplane. Now add on top of that the fact that the airplane itself costs significantly more than $120,000 in the post-pandemic peak market, maybe $150,000, maybe $175,000 for a nicer G1000 SP, and finance it at the higher rate. You're looking at monthly payments that have moved from the zone of aggressive but doable into the zone of genuinely hard to justify for a discretionary purchase that also comes with insurance, hangar fees, annual inspection costs, maintenance reserves, and fuel burns that have their own inflation story baked in. That is the wall buyers have been running into, and it's one of the primary reasons why demand has softened enough that sellers can no longer name their price and expect it to stick. The buyer pool hasn't disappeared. There are still plenty of people who want a 172 and can afford one. What's happened is the effective purchasing power of that buyer pool has been compressed by the rate environment, which means the ceiling on what any given buyer can or will pay has come down, and when the ceiling comes down on the demand side, prices follow if sellers want to actually transact, instead of just hold listings open indefinitely. Layered on top of the rate story is something that's been developing more gradually, but is now quite visible in the data, which is inventory. During the peak of the post-pandemic run, 172 inventory was genuinely constrained. If you were shopping in late 2021 or through most of 2022, you were looking at a thin market, not many examples listed, the good ones going fast, often with multiple competing offers. That scarcity justified the pricing psychology sellers were operating with, because it was real scarcity, not manufactured scarcity. When there are 12 buyers for every 5 airplanes, sellers hold all the leverage, and they know it. What's happened over the last 18 months or so is that inventory has been gradually rebuilding. The wave of buyers who came into the market during the pandemic boom has largely either bought their airplane or decided not to. The flight schools that were desperate to add to their fleets have mostly completed those purchases. The sellers who were holding back, waiting for the peak, are starting to list. Some because they need to for life reasons, some because they've looked at the listing landscape and decided that waiting longer isn't going to get them a better price than today offers. The result is that inventory has crept up meaningfully from where it was at the trough, and that matters enormously for buyer leverage and seller psychology. When there are 20 listings for a particular 172 variant instead of 8, a buyer's calculus changes in a fundamental way. They no longer feel the urgency that was so real during the lean years. They can see that if this particular listing doesn't work out, there are other options. They can negotiate more firmly, ask harder questions about airframe history and engine condition, and walk away from a deal that doesn't pencil without feeling like they've just lost their only shot at ownership for the foreseeable future. That psychological shift in the buyer's room is one of the most powerful forces in any asset market, and it is absolutely showing up in the 172 market right now, based on what the listing data from the last 90 days is reflecting. Now let me get into the actual data, because that's what this video is genuinely about, and I don't want to spend so much time on backstory that we run out of room for the specific numbers and trends that are actually actionable if you're in the market. The first and most important thing I want to show you in the 90-day data is what's happening to average days on market across different 172 segments, because days on market is almost always a leading indicator of price movement rather than a lagging one. When average DOM starts climbing, it usually precedes price drops by 60 to 90 days because sellers are slow to lower asking prices but eventually have to respond to the reality of their listing sitting stale. If you want to know where prices are going 6 months from now, watch days on market today. For mid-70s to early 80s 172s, your M&N models with Continental 0300 or Lycoming 0320 engines, basic steam gauge panels, or perhaps a modest avionics upgrade, the average days on market over the last 90 days has climbed noticeably compared to the same period a year ago, and dramatically compared to the peak of the market. Listings that were moving in under 2 weeks at their peak are now sitting for 30, 40, sometimes 50-plus days before finding a buyer. That is a meaningful signal, and it's the kind of signal that sellers in this segment have started reacting to, which is why we're also seeing, for the first time in a while, a pattern of price reductions appearing on listings that have been on the market more than 3 weeks. Those reductions are running, depending on the example, somewhere in the range of 4 to 10% off the initial ask, and in some cases more, when the seller needs to transact on a specific timeline. The story for 70s-era 172s is particularly interesting because this is the segment where the pricing run-up looked most aggressive relative to the underlying utility of what you're actually buying. A 1975 172M is a lovely airplane with a lot of history behind it, and there's genuine affection for these airframes among a certain type of pilot. But it is also an airplane with an engine architecture from the 1960s, an airframe that requires careful attention to corrosion and fatigue after 50 years of service, and a panel that, unless significantly updated at real cost, is a significant step behind what a newer example offers. The buyers who were paying peak prices for these airplanes were, to a meaningful degree, caught up in the general market energy of a period when prices were rising and everything was moving fast. That energy has dissipated. The buyers who remain are more price disciplined, and the data is reflecting it. For the G1000 equipped 172 SPs from roughly 2000 through 2010, which represent the most popular flight school transition purchase and probably the most liquid single segment within the broader 172 market, the days on market increase is somewhat more modest than the older steam gauge examples, but it's still there and still meaningful. These airplanes move faster than their older counterparts because the buyer pool is larger. Flight schools, instrument students who want glass, pilots stepping into their first serious cross-country machine. But even here, the listings that came out of the gate priced at the very top of what the peak market was supporting are sitting longer than they would have a year ago, and we're seeing the same pattern of eventual price reductions appearing on anything that doesn't move within about 30 days. The segment where the data looks most stable, and where sellers still have the most leverage in the current environment, is low-time G1000 172 SPs from roughly 2010 to 2018, with engine time well under 500 hours remaining to overhaul, fresh annuals, and clean maintenance logs. These are genuinely the most desirable examples in the market, and because they're the most desirable, the buyer pool for them is always the most competitive. Even here, though, the days on market numbers are edging upward, and a seller who prices one of these optimistically rather than accurately is finding the market less forgiving than it was even 6 months ago. The window where you could list at a price that was clearly aggressive and expect a buyer to show up anyway because they were afraid to miss out has mostly closed. What's happening with actual transaction prices, meaning what airplanes are actually selling for as opposed to what they were listed at, is harder to pin down precisely, because unlike in residential real estate, aircraft sale prices don't typically get publicly recorded in a way that aggregates cleanly into a database. But there are ways to triangulate it. You can look at listing price versus eventual sale price when sellers update their listings. You can look at what asking prices look like on fresh listings compared to the same type of airplane listed 6 months ago. You can track the pattern of price reductions and the final listing price before a unit goes to sale pending status. And you can supplement all of that with what brokers and lenders who are actually in the middle of these transactions are seeing and reporting. Putting all of that together for the last 90 days, the picture that emerges for the 172 market broadly is something like this. Compared to where asking prices were camped in the 12 months running from mid-2022 to mid-2023, which represents approximately the peak of post-pandemic 172 valuations, the market has now moved somewhere between 12 and 18% lower on a transaction basis, depending on the specific segment and example. That's not a crash. Let me be absolutely clear about that, because I don't want anyone to take that number out of context. This is a meaningful correction from an inflated peak, and it looks a lot more modest and orderly when you put it in the context of how far prices moved on the way up. An airplane that ran from $80,000 to $125,000 at peak and is now transacting around $106,000 has given back about 15% of its peak price and is still up significantly from where it was before the pandemic demand wave hit. The sellers who bought at peak and are selling today are in a different spot than the sellers who bought pre-pandemic and are selling today. And that distinction matters a lot. What the data does show very clearly is that the rate of price reduction has accelerated meaningfully in the last 90 days compared to the preceding 90 days. We're not in the early slow phase of this correction anymore, where you might argue it was just noise. We're now in a phase where the trend is clear enough and broad enough across the 172 market that it's very hard to dismiss as anything other than a genuine market-level repricing. The question isn't whether prices are correcting. The question, which we'll get to, is how far this goes and how fast. Before we go there, let me walk through the regional variation in what the data shows, because this is one of the most important nuances in the whole picture, and it's consistently underappreciated by people who are looking at national averages and assuming they apply everywhere equally. The 172 market in the Mountain West and Pacific Northwest is behaving differently from the 172 market in the Southeast and the Gulf Coast states, and both of those are different from what's happening in the Upper Midwest and the Great Plains. Some of those differences are weather and seasonality related. A tie-down at a mountain state airport where the flying season is relatively compressed creates different demand seasonality than a tie-down in Florida where the airplane can fly year-round. And seasonal demand variations show up in days-on-market data in ways that can distort a simple national average. But some of the regional variation is more structural and more interesting than just seasonality. In markets where flight school density is high and where training activity has been strong, think Central and Southern Texas, much of Florida, the Phoenix metro area, demand for G1000-172 SPs in particular has held up relatively better because schools are still in need of training aircraft and are actively looking for examples to add to their fleets. Flight school acquisition of used 172s is a form of institutional demand that tends to be somewhat less rate-sensitive than individual buyer demand because schools are making financing decisions at a business level where the cost-benefit calculation includes revenue generation, not just affordability. That institutional demand has acted as a partial floor under prices in training-dense markets and is part of why the correction has been less dramatic in some of those areas than a national average would imply. In contrast, markets that are more heavily weighted toward private ownership, areas where a lot of 172s are owned by individual weekend pilots rather than operated by flight schools, have seen the buyer pool thin out more noticeably, and the correction there has been somewhat sharper. This makes intuitive sense. Private buyers are the most rate-sensitive buyers because they're making a purely discretionary financial decision with no revenue offset to recalibrate the math against. When financing gets materially more expensive, the purely discretionary buyer is the first to step back, and the markets where they represent the largest share of demand have felt that most directly. There's another regional story worth flagging, which is what's happening in high-cost living areas in the Northeast and coastal California, where discretionary spending on aviation has always been driven by a fairly narrow demographic of very high earners, who are, broadly speaking, less sensitive to the rate environment simply because they have the resources to absorb it. In these markets, the correction is real, but has been somewhat less dramatic than elsewhere, because the buyer who's shopping for a 172 in an expensive coastal metro was probably never financing it at the margins in the first place, and rate changes that significantly reshape the math for a buyer in the Midwest or South don't reshape the math the same way for a buyer in the Bay Area or the Boston suburbs who was writing a larger check to begin with. The price correction is there, but it's shown up more in days on market and seller negotiating flexibility than in dramatic absolute price declines. Now let's talk about what's driving the correction beyond the rate story, because interest rates are important, but they're not the whole picture, and understanding the other factors is what gives you a clearer view of where this goes from here. One major factor that doesn't get discussed enough in aviation market analysis is what I'd describe as the maintenance reality check that a lot of pandemic-era buyers are now working through. During the frenzy of 2020 through 2022, buyers were moving fast. Inspections were getting compressed or rushed because sellers had multiple interested parties and weren't willing to wait for a thorough pre-buy. And the emotional energy of the market was not exactly conducive to cold, sober analysis of what an aging airframe was going to cost to own and operate over the following 3 to 5 years. Some of those buyers are now 3 years into ownership of an airplane that's required more than they anticipated, whether that's a prop strike inspection that came back with findings, an exhaust system that needed replacing, a fuel system issue, a landing gear actuator that's been intermittently grumbling, or simply the cumulative weight of deferred maintenance that the previous owner passed along and the pre-buy didn't catch because the pre-buy wasn't as thorough as it should have been, given how fast everything was moving. When those buyers come to sell, and some of them are listing now, which is part of what's added inventory to the market over the last year, they're running into a more sophisticated buyer who's heard these stories and is asking harder questions about maintenance history, who's insisting on a more thorough pre-buy, and who's adjusting their offer accordingly when the inspection turns up anything less than completely clean paperwork. That seller, who may have overpaid at the peak and put money into maintenance since, often can't get what they need to break even or recover their costs without pricing themselves above where the current market will support. And the result is a listing that either sits a long time or eventually transacts at a price the seller didn't want to accept. That dynamic, a wave of motivated sellers in the market with complicated ownership histories and varying levels of maintenance investment, is adding supply-side pressure that's distinct from and additional to the demand-side compression from the rate environment. You've got both sides working in the same direction, which is one of the reasons the correction has moved as clearly as it has in the 90-day data. There's a third factor that's specifically interesting for the 172 market and doesn't apply in quite the same way to other piston types, and that's the ongoing uncertainty around leaded avgas. The 172 and its various engine configurations are right in the middle of the transition story around 100 LL, and the alternatives that are working their way through the certification and distribution process. For most of the private pilot world, the 172 is the airplane they fly for training and early ownership, and that means it's the airplane most directly affected by questions about what's happening with the fuel supply over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, the actual situation on unleaded alternatives is, at this point, meaningfully better than it was a couple of years ago, from an immediate availability and approval standpoint, and I don't want to overstate the uncertainty. But buyer psychology doesn't move at the same speed as regulatory progress, and there is still a real contingent of buyers, particularly those newer to aviation who haven't been following the fuel transition story closely, who have real, if somewhat imprecise concerns about whether the airplane they're buying today is going to need expensive modifications to run on whatever fuel the future looks like. That concern is showing up in buyer conversations, in the questions that come up during pre-purchase inquiries, and in some cases in offers that have been discounted relative to what the seller expected as a risk adjustment for the fuel story specifically. For sellers, this means that buyers have a ready-made additional negotiating point that didn't exist in quite the same way during the peak of the market, when buyers were so eager to secure a deal that they weren't looking for reasons to negotiate the price down. Now that buyers have more leverage and more patience, they're using every reasonable point they can find, and the fuel uncertainty narrative, however overstated in some individual buyers' minds, is one of those points. The data shows it in the gap between initial offer and eventual transaction price on a meaningful share of listings, particularly for older airframes with engine configurations that have a longer path to full unleaded fuel compatibility. Insurance is another layer worth unpacking, specifically in the context of the current correction, because it connects to something we've touched on but need to go deeper on. The 172 has always been one of the most underwriting-friendly types in general aviation, precisely because of its ubiquity and its history. Underwriters have decades of data on the 172's accident rates across different pilot experience levels, different mission profiles, different geographic markets. That familiarity generally works in the 172 buyer's favor when getting a quote, which is one of the reasons first-time airplane buyers gravitate toward the type. It's not just the training history and the parts availability, it's also the fact that the insurance conversation tends to be more predictable and less painful than it is for something more exotic or less common. That said, the broader tightening of the GA insurance market over the last 2 years has not completely spared the 172, and it's affecting the buyer pool in a specific and measurable way. The entry-level pilot buyer, someone with a private certificate, maybe a couple hundred hours, wanting to step from renting into owning, is having a noticeably harder time with insurance than they would have had 3 or 4 years ago. It's not that they're being turned away from the 172 specifically, the way they might be from a more complex high-performance type, but the premium has moved up meaningfully. The minimum hour requirements have gotten more explicit, and in some cases, underwriters are requiring dual instruction in type before granting solo privileges in a newly purchased airplane, which is a friction cost in time and money that the buyer wasn't necessarily planning for. For a buyer who's already squeezed by higher interest rates on the financing side, discovering that insurance is going to run 15 to 20% more annually than they expected, based on a conversation with a friend who bought a couple of years ago, is real additional pressure on whether the total monthly cost of ownership pencils. Some of those buyers are still doing the deal, just with a somewhat more modest airplane than they initially had in mind. Some are pushing their timeline out and waiting, and some, after running all the actual numbers rather than rough estimates, are deciding to stay in the rental market for longer. Every one of those decisions, at the margin, reduces demand for the 172 in the ownership market, and the aggregate of all those individual decisions shows up as the softened demand that's allowing the price correction to happen. Now, let me address something directly, because I know a certain percentage of the people watching this are sellers who are hoping I'm about to say the correction is going to reverse and prices are going back up. I want to be straightforward with you about what the data actually suggests, because giving you a comfortable answer that isn't accurate would be genuinely worse than a clear-eyed one. The forces driving this correction are not short-lived or self-resolving on a fast timeline. Interest rates are not coming down dramatically or quickly, based on anything we can see in the current economic environment. The inventory that has been building on the market is not going to disappear overnight. Those airplanes need to find buyers, and buyers are moving at a pace dictated by affordability and confidence, not by what sellers would prefer. The insurance environment shows no signs of a meaningful reversal of the tightening trend in the near term, and the wave of new buyers that was such a powerful demand force during the pandemic period isn't going to regenerate the same way, because the psychological conditions that produced it, the forced reevaluation of priorities, the availability of low-cost capital, the sense that the old normal had been suspended, are not going to repeat themselves on any near-term horizon. None of that means the 172 market is going to collapse. I want to be genuinely clear about that, because the word correction gets interpreted catastrophically by people who are already nervous about their asset position, and that's not what the data is describing. The 172 is a deeply established, deeply liquid type with institutional demand from flight schools that acts as a real structural floor under the market. It's not going to zero. It's not going to see the kind of absolute price implosion that some other asset classes have experienced in past downturns. What it is going to do, based on everything the 90-day data suggests, is continue a gradual, measured slide from its peak valuation toward a new equilibrium that reflects the current demand and financing environment more accurately than the pandemic peak prices ever did. My honest read of where that equilibrium lands, based on the current trend velocity and the underlying drivers, is a total peak-to-trough correction in the range of 20 to 28% for the broader 172 market, depending on segment and configuration, with some portion of that correction already having happened and the remainder working its way through over the next 12 to 24 months. That's not uniformly distributed. Older steam gauge airframes are likely to see the larger corrections, while well-maintained low-time G1000 SPs will see more modest adjustments. But it's a useful frame for how to think about the scale of the repricing that the data is pointing toward. Now let's switch to what this actually means for different types of people watching this video, because the implications are genuinely different depending on where you're sitting. If you're a buyer who's been on the sidelines waiting to see if prices would come down before committing, the data says you were right to wait, and the window you were waiting for is now open and probably getting more favorable over the next several months. But I want to add some important nuance to that, because timing a market is always a game that rewards humility over certainty. The question isn't whether prices are lower than they were at the peak. They clearly are, and the data confirms it. The question is whether waiting 6 more months gets you a meaningfully better deal than acting now, and the answer to that question depends heavily on what you're specifically looking for. For the older, higher-hour steam gauge airframes, there is very likely more price movement ahead of us than behind us, and if you're shopping in that segment specifically because of budget constraints, there's a credible argument for patience. Inventory is building, days on market is extending, and motivated sellers in that segment are going to have to get meaningfully more realistic about pricing as time passes and their listings don't move. 6 months of patience from today might get you a meaningfully better outcome in that specific segment. For the G1000 equipped mid-2000s to early 2010s SPs in good condition, the calculus is more nuanced. These are the most in-demand segment, and while there is softening happening there too, the institutional demand from flight schools provides a floor that means the downward movement is likely to be more modest and more slow-moving than in the older segments. If you're looking in that category and you find an example with genuinely clean logs, good engine time, a fresh annual, and a price that's already come down to something in the range of what current market reality supports, trying to hold out for the last 5 or 8% of downside movement may not be worth the risk of missing a genuinely good example that meets all your criteria. Good airplanes that are priced honestly still move. The correction is in the frothy, wishful listings, not necessarily in every single example of the type. The one thing I would tell every buyer in the current market without any nuance or qualification is this: get your insurance quote before you make an offer, not after. I know this sounds basic. I know most people reading it think they already know this, and yet, based on what's happening in real transactions right now, there is still a meaningful share of buyers who fall in love with a specific airplane, agree to a price, and only then have the insurance conversation with their broker, at which point they discover the premium makes the total cost of ownership look different than they'd planned. In a market where insurance has genuinely gotten more expensive and more restrictive for buyers below certain experience thresholds, the insurance number is not a detail you can safely leave for after the emotional investment has already been made. It's a first step, not a last one. For sellers, the honest message from the data is one that's going to be uncomfortable to hear, but is far more useful than the alternative, which is waiting and hoping. The sellers who are going to do best in the next 12 to 18 months are the ones who price accurately and honestly for the current market right now, not for where prices were 18 months ago, and not for where they'd like them to be. The data is unambiguous that overpriced listings are sitting for much longer than they were, and that the eventual transaction price on a listing that's been sitting for 8 or 10 weeks is lower than what the same airplane would have sold for quickly if priced correctly at the outset. The carrying costs of an airplane that doesn't sell, insurance, hangar, opportunity cost of the tied-up capital, are real and they compound. A seller who insists on the price they want and waits 3 extra months for a buyer who never comes at that price hasn't actually held out for more money. They've paid 3 months of carrying costs and sold for less in the end. The right strategy for sellers right now is to look honestly at where comparable examples are actually transacting, not just what asking prices are on other listings, and then price your airplane at or slightly below that transaction level, rather than at the top of the asking price range. In the current market, that approach generates faster movement, reduces carrying time, and actually produces better net outcomes than the optimistic price and wait strategy that worked well during the peak. That's not a comfortable message if you bought near the top and need to sell, but it's what the data says clearly. There's one more thing I want to walk through, which is the financing picture specifically for 172 buyers and sellers right now, because this is an area where the details have changed in ways that aren't obvious, unless you've been in recent conversations with lenders who are actively doing aviation deals. Aviation lenders, the specialty lenders who focus on light aircraft financing and understand the asset class in a way that a generic bank or credit union may not, have gotten meaningfully more careful over the last 12 to 18 months about valuation and loan-to-value ratios in the current correction environment. This matters a lot for buyers who are planning to finance a meaningful portion of their purchase and for sellers who are planning to receive all of their purchase price at closing. Here's the specific risk. If a buyer makes an offer on a 172 at a price the seller wants, and the lender's appraisal comes back with a value below that purchase price, which is happening with increasing frequency as appraisers try to catch up to where the market actually is rather than where peak-era comps suggested it should be, the buyer is suddenly in a position where their financing only covers a percentage of the appraised value, not the purchase price, meaning they need to either put more cash down than they'd planned, renegotiate the price down to something the appraisal supports, or walk away from the deal. All three of those outcomes create friction and sometimes kill transactions that both parties genuinely wanted to complete. Sellers need to understand that their airplane's appraised value for financing purposes is not the same as whatever they're asking for it, and in a correcting market where appraisers are catching up to current conditions, the gap between seller expectation and appraiser conclusion can be meaningful. Pricing your airplane at a level that's defensible given recent comparable transactions isn't just about attracting buyers faster. It's also about ensuring that the transactions that do get to contract stage actually close, rather than falling apart at the financing stage because the numbers don't work out the way the seller assumed they would. For buyers, the lender-specific advice I'd give in the current environment is to work with a lender who specializes in aviation and has a current, active portfolio in the light aircraft category, not a general lender who happens to offer aviation financing as a sideline. The specialty lenders have the appraisal relationships and the market awareness to get to accurate valuations faster, and to structure deals that actually close without surprises. And in the current environment where valuation is a live variable rather than a settled question, that expertise is worth a lot more than the marginal rate savings you might theoretically find from a lender who doesn't really know the asset class. Also pay attention to the conversation about loan terms, because this is another place where the current environment is meaningfully different from the peak. During the years when aviation lenders were competing hard for business in a strong market, terms were generous. 15-year amortizations were common. Down payment requirements were sometimes as low as 10 or 15% on a 172, and underwriting was relatively permissive. Some lenders have tightened those terms in the current environment, either requiring higher down payments, shorter amortization periods, or more documentation around the borrower's income and financial position than was standard a couple of years ago. None of this is a deal breaker if you're genuinely positioned to buy, but it can change your cash flow math meaningfully if you were budgeting based on peak-era lending conditions rather than current ones. And discovering that your down payment needs to be 20% instead of 15% on a $150,000 airplane is a $1,500 difference in cash out of pocket at closing that's worth knowing about before you're in the middle of a transaction. Let me pull all of this together into a clear picture of where I think we actually are and where we're going, because I want this video to leave you with something actionable, rather than just a collection of data points you have to synthesize yourself. The Cessna 172 price correction is real. It is already underway, and the 90-day listing data confirms it clearly across multiple metrics: days on market, frequency of price reductions, gap between initial asking price and eventual transaction price, and the volume of inventory sitting in the upper price bands with no movement. The correction has been most pronounced in older high-hour steam gauge examples and least pronounced in clean low-time G1000 SPs, with everything in between falling on a spectrum that reflects the quality, desirability, and segment-specific demand dynamics of each subcategory. The drivers of the correction, rate environment, building inventory, insurance tightening, maintenance reality checks from pandemic-era buyers, and ongoing fuel transition uncertainty, are not going to reverse quickly. The correction has more runway ahead of it, likely landing somewhere in a peak-to-trough range of 20 to 25% or more for the segments most affected. And the next 12 months of data are probably going to show continued softening, even if the pace of movement is more gradual than the last 90 days suggested. Buyers with patience and a clear understanding of the market have genuine opportunity right now, particularly in the older segments where sellers have been slowest to adjust and where inventory is deepest. Buyers looking for the best examples of the most desirable G1000 SPs should do their homework carefully before waiting for a correction that may be more modest than in other segments and that might not improve their outcome significantly, versus acting on a genuinely good example at a fair current price. Sellers who want to actually transact in the next 6 to 12 months need to accept current market reality rather than peak market memory. Price accordingly from day one, rather than gradually reducing from an aspirational starting